This is Lunchtime Agenda.
G'day and welcome to the program. I'm David Lipson. On the show today, a topic that's sure to fire a lot of people up, housing affordability. Of course, it's always been difficult to own your own home in this country, and many would argue with interest rates at record lows and with a pretty flat housing market ever since the GFC, now it's perhaps easier than it's been in a long time to own your own home. But we're going to hear from a voice that we don't hear from that often in this area, Generation Y. Tom Whitty is a TV producer and a freelance writer, and last week he wrote an article for Fairfax where he pointed the finger at politicians, baby boomers, real estate agents and the media for the problems that his generation faces entering the housing market. We're also going to hear a response from the Housing Minister, Mark Butler, but first, my interview with Tom Whitty. Tom Whitty, thanks for your time. It's always been hard for people to break into the housing market. Why do you say that it's so much harder for Generation Y and others today?
Well, David, because it is. I mean, it's not just me saying that either, and it's simply a numbers game. If you look at the average cost of a house and compare that to the average wage, which is basically what most people use to gauge housing affordability, the reality is that right now it's more expensive than it's ever been. That ratio is higher than it's been, ever been. If you from 1960 to about 1989, so we're talking about 30 years, it fluctuated from about 2.6 to 3.7, and right now, 2012, it's 7.2, so it's doubled.
You've argued that the whole system really is pretty much skewed against Generation Y. Take us through that argument.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did say that in my article that Generation Y is suffering, but I don't just think it's Generation Y that the market is skewed against. I think that there's been successive governments introducing policy that has encouraged speculation on the housing market to the detriment of people who, at this point, are trying to buy their first home. So what that means is, you've got basically take 99 Howard, halves capital gains tax, and that combined with negative gearing basically sent the people crazy, and the cost of the average home doubled in 4 years. When you've got that sort of thing going on, the last 10 years, the cost of the average house has gone up 147%, while the average wage has only gone up 57%. It's just not, the numbers aren't sustainable. It's not a Gen Y whinge. It's just a reality that people who want to buy their first home are doing it hard.
Okay, so looking at solutions then, as you just mentioned, you say that negative gearing is part of the problem. So you're saying we should get rid of it?
No, I don't think we should scrap negative gearing. I mean, what I think we should do is certainly address it. And I'm not the first person to say that. Much more important people than me have said that. Ken Henry said that in the Henry Tax Review. What my issue is with negative gearing is that currently it allows people to speculate on the housing market on existing dwellings. So people are basically getting a tax break on existing dwellings, and it's not encouraging growth. It's not encouraging people to build new dwellings. And that's where my issue is. So if we had, if you get people who work really hard and save a lot of money and build a new house, and they want to use, they want to negative gear that property, I don't see why there's a problem for that. I don't have a problem with that. But my issue is where people are doing that, and it means that there's more people trying to buy houses. There's more people competing with first home buyers with existing dwellings.
Investment in housing is such a huge and important part of the economy, and also the baby boomers who own most of the houses are such an important demographic politically. With that in mind, do you have any hope that anything will actually be done?
Well, I would hope that. I would hope that it would change. I'd hope the numbers would be enough for it to change. I mean, it is a relatively new problem. It's something that's sort of become a real problem since, as I mentioned, since the capital gains tax was halved in '99. The housing has just gone through the roof. The cost of housing has gone through the roof. But a lot of important people, as I said, have said that this is a real issue, and they've been ignored in the past. The government commissioned a report and the Henry tax review suggested that this it was something that we could do, addressing negative gearing, and it was ignored. It was ruled out. And there seems to be, obviously, I think that it's a political minefield for politicians, and I completely understand that. When they're asked to basically tell an ageing population, of whom there are a lot of them, and they are voters, and they're very vocal, when you tell those people that they can't make money from their number one asset, you're not going to be very popular and you're not going to stay in your job very long. But what I want to see are politicians who are brave enough to see that there's a real issue for young Australians here, young people who want to put a roof over their head, they want to own a house, they want to raise families, and they shouldn't have to be doing it as hard as they are. Yes, buying a house is really hard, and it has been for a long time, but because houses are expensive. If they were cheap, then everyone would own them. But they've never been this expensive. That's the reality. That's the numbers. It's not a whinge. I just want to see, politicians recognise that, and they do recognise it. They admit there's a housing affordability problem, but they don't recognise, or they won't admit, that there's a problem with policy around real estate, and they're intentionally, I believe, turning a blind eye to it to some degree.
Well, there's some interesting claims put there by Tom Whitty, and I put a few of those claims and asked for a response from the Minister responsible, the Housing Minister, Mark Butler. Mark Butler, thanks for your time. Politicians of all persuasions have acknowledged the housing affordability crisis. You've put incentives in place for development of lower cost housing. Do you have any evidence that has had an impact?
Well, since the global financial crisis, the Commonwealth Government funding has contributed to the construction of about 1 in 20 of the houses that have been built during that time. About 500,000 houses, 1 in 20 of them, contributed to by the Commonwealth Government, because what we saw in the wake of the global financial crisis was a very big hit to the housing industry. And really the affordability crisis that spiked under the last few years of the Howard government is largely one driven by questions of supply, whether there are enough new houses in the market for particularly people looking to buy their first home. So, look, there are a range of pressures here, many of them very broad economic pressures, but the government's policies over the last few years have significantly alleviated housing affordability issues. We've seen in the last 8 quarters the HIA and Commonwealth Bank Affordability Index has improved. We've seen 8 consecutive quarters of improvement in affordability conditions. I mean, that's significantly due to large reductions in interest rates, but at the same time we've also seen a moderation in house prices in the wake of the GFC, while household incomes are continuing to rise. A far preferable position really than any other Western country I can think of.
But the cost of a home has risen in the last decade far more than the average wage. And just to go directly to some of the points we heard from Tom Whitty a little earlier, firstly, negative gearing. I mean, we do lead the world in terms of generosity towards negative gearing, and Ken Henry has said that this leads to investors taking on too much debt and distorts the market. Why is the government being so generous in regards to negative gearing?
Well, negative gearing is a policy that's been in place for a significant period of time, and this government has made it clear that we don't intend to change government policy about that. There are very different policies around the world about the treatment of mortgage interest. It's tax deductible in a broader sense in the US, for example. I mean, the thing is that for the first 6 or 7 years of the last decade, there was a huge explosion in house prices across the Western world, probably the biggest asset bubble in human history. We think to the tune of about $30 trillion US. And that was largely due to the fact that there was significant amounts of relatively cheap money available across the West, and people were steering clear of the stock market, particularly in the wake of the dot-com bust. So affordability conditions really did decline over the last few years of the Howard government, not helped by the fact that really interest rates got away from them. What we've seen since the GFC, though, is quite a different picture. We've seen a relatively soft landing on house prices here in Australia, which is very fortunate, because if we'd seen a big decline in house values, that would have had very significant ramifications for the broader economy and potentially have pushed our economy into recession. That's what we saw in the US, where house prices or house values have dropped by 20% in the last last 5 years, 25% in Spain, 11% in the Great Britain, 14% in Japan. These have been big drivers of the economy in a downward sense. So what we need to do is balance really the different conditions that contribute to affordability, a moderation in house prices, big reductions in interest rates under this government, while household budgets or household income continues to increase. Now, that doesn't mean that that affordability issues have been resolved. They're much better than they were under the last few years of the Howard government, but there is still significant things for us to do.
Well, what about then something like capital gains tax? We did see, as we heard Tom say, the cost of a home double in 4 years after the Howard government halved capital gains tax, and you've been referring to the Howard government, the years that he was in power, being a big or a tough time for housing affordability. So would you consider tweaking capital gains tax, perhaps putting some limits on some of the exemptions there?
No, we don't intend to make any change to capital gains tax, and there are a range of different drivers of house prices, usually upwards during those years. The way in which the first homeowners scheme operated, I think generally is seen to be something that stimulated house prices. As I said, some of those macroeconomic drivers where people were investing in houses across the Western world was an issue, and also affordability didn't improve because interest rates frankly got away from the Howard government. Essentially, this question is going to be largely driven by housing supply. So the major focus of this government over the last several years is on trying to stimulate housing supply, the construction of new houses, particularly for people who are first homeowners or first home buyers, to get into the market. That's something we've been focused on, and many of the barriers to that, frankly, are state government issues. Some of the development approval processes, frankly, take far too long and lead to an increase in holding costs for developers that feeds through into prices. Some of the infrastructure costs like roads, open space, connection to utilities, again is something we're trying to alleviate through our Housing Affordability Fund, but is largely something in the realm of state governments.
What about rental affordability? What's the government doing to ease those pressures?
Well, this is something that flowed again from the increase in house prices, largely across the Western world in the last several years of the Howard government. We saw the price-rent ratio, which is the ratio of house prices to rents in the market, increase very dramatically. And because of that, investors in the housing market started to lift rents quite significantly for some years, and private rents are frankly quite expensive at the moment. Rental properties are in short supply, so you know there's pretty significant competition for someone wanting to get into the private rental market. So what we decided to do when we came to government was to stimulate the private rental market by creating 50,000 new affordable rental properties through the National Rental Affordability Scheme. By affordable, I mean properties that must be rented at a price at least 20% the prevailing market rate. Sorry, 20% below the prevailing market rate, and we're a good way through the rollout of those properties. And I only announced in the last couple of weeks the opening of the fifth and final round of the National Rental Affordability Scheme.
Mark Butler, the Housing Minister, speaking to me earlier. A very interesting topic. We'd love to hear your thoughts at Your Say or on Twitter, #LunchAgenda. After the break, we'll have more of the day's news.